Good morning. My name is Eric Wishart. I'm the first Vice President of the FCC and also a journalist at AFP News Agency. Welcome. I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker this morning, Esther Chan, who's the APAC Asia Pacific Bureau Chief of First Draft. And she'll be explaining today how vaccine disinformation has actually been around for quite a while, but how it applies to the COVID vaccine, which is actually just being rolled out in Hong Kong as we speak. So thank you for joining us, Esther. Before I get into the presentation, I'd just like to mention a couple of events coming up next week. We have Carmela von Buena, who's the author of Marawi Siege Stories from the Front Lines, which is on March the 8th. And Elizabeth Becker, an author who's written a book about 3 women war correspondents in Vietnam, one of whom was a dearly loved member of the FCC, Kate Webb, who was a colleague of mine at AFP for many years. So that is on March the 9th. And of course, it's great to have 2 great women speakers in the week when we have International Women's Day. So that's next week. So for today, this is going to be a workshop focused on how to cover and how to look at the pitfalls of covering the COVID-19 vaccine. So please send questions to the email that you will have received in your invitations. Please make sure you get the email right. Somebody said last week they sent a good question, but they got the address wrong, so be careful of that. I just we've had 2 or 3 good questions already, but they're on the medical side of it. This is not we may have a panel another time about the merits and demerits of the different vaccines, but please focus on the question at hand, which is this sort of misinformation about the vaccine. So Esther is Sydney-based APAC Bureau Chief of First Draft. She started her career in television as an investigative reporter in Hong Kong before moving on to digital journalism at Storyful, which was one of the groundbreaking sites that was debunking online or verifying online information, online uploads. She evolved from a journalist specialized in online news gathering and verification of eyewitness content to deputy editor in Hong Kong and news editor in Australia. Storyful, her work delved deeper into cross-platform, cross-border, multilingual coordinated disinformation campaigns. She's participated in several editions of Google News Initiative's news literacy projects, helping train journalists in the APAC region in identifying threat actors and deepening understanding of the online disinformation landscape. So she's a real expert in the whole disinformation fake news ecosystem. She recently helped launch the Australian branch of Agence France Presse's fact-check operation in 2019 in Australia. And she's been covering social media anomalies and disinformation primarily in Australia, Hong Kong, and China. And now she is, as I said, the bureau editor of First Draft based in Sydney. So I don't think we could have a better expert to talk us through this very challenging topic this morning. So Esther, over to you.
Thank you so much, Eric. And hi, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here with you this morning to talk about vaccine misinformation. So like Eric said, it's just in time because Hong Kong, as well as where I am in Sydney, in Australia, they both just started their vaccine rollout in the past couple of weeks. So I feel like this is the right time that we learn about, some tactics, how to spot misinformation and how to tackle them. So thank you so much to the FCC as well for having me. Let me share my slides with you. There you go. All right, so today we will talk about misinformation surrounding COVID-19 vaccines, and we'll go over some broad topics and essential concepts about the misinformation surrounding the vaccines, right? So you may have seen these photos online in the past couple of weeks. they're supposed to show the Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam and her administration getting the Sinovac vaccine a couple of weeks ago. But then after they were vaccinated, a lot of people started saying that the syringe was evidence that they were actually given either the Pfizer or AstraZeneca vaccines. So even though this claim was unproven, it quickly went viral online in the night after they got the shot and in the next day as well. Later on, the Hong Kong government said that Carrie Lam and the minister did have the Sinovac vaccine and that the Pfizer one hadn't even arrived yet. So this is one of the examples that shows with vaccine rollout, misinformation also starts to proliferate online. And it can be because of a number of reasons, maybe limited data about a vaccine, lack of confidence in its efficacy, or even in general, a lack of trust in the government. So all of these sentiments make people who are maybe already a bit skeptical about vaccine feel like they're even more hesitant about getting it. So today, we're going to try to understand how misinformation can erode trust in vaccine and the types of common misinformation that people tend to share. And so before we begin, I want to let you know about a bunch of free resources that First Draft developed specifically about vaccine misinformation. So we just launched our Vaccine Insights Hub a couple months ago. It has a whole bunch of very useful information there. So like vaccine narratives that our editorial team is tracking. We've also got search tips for monitoring misinformation. We have information on Google Trends related to vaccine. So just a bunch of things there. So please feel free, go ahead and check it out. Also at the same page, you can register for our flexible learning courses about vaccine misinformation. So like how to monitor it and how to find it online. And they're 13-minute long and all free. And if you're interested, you can also sign up to our new weekly newsletter, which will help you keep track of the latest misinformation and conspiracy theories about vaccine. So there's also a link there where you can sign up. So I guess we just hope that these resources will be helpful, especially now, because more and more countries around the world are beginning their vaccine drive. So yeah, and just to introduce myself, my name is Esther Chan. I'm the APAC Bureau Editor at First Draft, and we're an organization that helps journalists, academics, the general public as well, to build resilience against harmful, misleading information. Okay, so this is the agenda. Today, we're going to talk about three things. The first is some case studies looking at why different communities around the world have lost trust in vaccines. Then we're going to talk about some of the research that our team did into vaccine misinformation. So some of the big themes that we found. And then we're going to talk about some tactics for spreading misinformation, which is how the people who spread misinformation do so effectively. And in between each section, we'll take a short break and maybe answer some of your questions. So without further ado, let's talk about trust in vaccines. And we're going to look at a few case studies from around the world to help us understand why certain communities lack trust in vaccines. First case study. Pakistan is one of the few countries in the world where polio is still endemic. And in April 2019, misleading videos claiming that kids were falling ill from the polio vaccine went viral. And then the efforts to vaccinate Pakistani children in the northern city of Peshawar came to a standstill. So once these videos went viral, there was panic, and then around 25,000 children in Pakistan were rushed to hospitals, which is a big number. And at the time, the deputy police commissioner told CNN, people rushed to the loudspeakers of nearby mosques, barring people to stop polio drops to their children. They also suggested people to take their children to hospital immediately, as some poisonous material has been added to the vaccine. So you can see that in this chart, that the polio cases in Pakistan has started to be contained in recent years. And then these misleading videos were shared in 2019, and boom, you can see how trust in vaccine fell and the polio cases just skyrocketed. This is a similar graph showing Google search interest on related keywords such as polio, vaccine, polio drops, polio in Pakistan, and also polio in Urdu. And you can see again that the search interest was pretty low. And then by 22nd of April, when these videos started circulating online, the interest spiked. The thing is though, people probably had good reason to be worried about vaccine in this same region in northern Pakistan, because in 2011, the CIA orchestrated a failed vaccination campaign to obtain Osama bin Laden's family DNA. So there was actually a real instance of Western influence. And this is interesting, broadly speaking, because as we often notice from our research, misinformation and conspiracy theories often have a kernel of truth. And in the case of Pakistan, we can safely say that the mistrust that erupted over the polio vaccine in 2019 was also against this backdrop of a recent event in history. So what we can learn from this is that misleading videos may have sparked the breakdown in trust, but there was also a real history of Western influence exploiting health workers in the same region. So for sure, misinformation was a problem and it was a spark for the loss in confidence in vaccine. But there were also historical problems that sort of set people up for it. Our next case study is the Philippines with the dengue controversy. And what is dengue fever? Dengue fever is a mosquito-borne viral infection now endemic in more than 100 countries in the world, including the Philippines. And let's take a look at the timeline, which shows a gradual erosion of public trust in the vaccine. So back in December 2015, the dengue vaccine was registered in the Philippines to fight the rising spread of dengue fever. 3 months later, in March 2016, some health experts said that they're a little bit hesitant about the vaccine. And then a month later, in April, they started a school-based vaccination program with dengue, and more than 800,000 people were vaccinated at this point of time. But then, in the same month, the producer of the vaccine, Sanofi, said that the vaccine may be dangerous in rare cases of children who haven't had the infection. So in the following year, in November 2017, the government of the Philippines did a policy 180 and halted the whole vaccination program, which set off a moral panic, as you can imagine. And then in January 2018, there was a protracted Senate investigation about dengue. There were viral claims that children were dying from the vaccine, and there was also media amplification of all of that. So what happened in the end? According to data from the Vaccine Confidence Index, in 2015, there were 93% people in the Philippines saying that they were confident in vaccine. And then following, what happened with dengue, it went down to 32% in 2018. So what happened was basically in 3 years' time, from 2015, when dengue was registered in the Philippines, to January 2018, during the Senate investigation, vaccine confidence plummeted by 60%. So what we can learn from this case study, as well as the Pakistan misleading claims, is that we're only a part of the breakdown in trust. Because in both cases, misinformation played an important role. But as you can see, the contextual backdrop to it was pretty different. In the case of Pakistan, there were historical reasons to mistrust the intentions of the vaccination project because of Western influence. We also had the fact that the Philippines suspended the vaccination program entirely instead of just, introducing strict guidelines on labeling, which is what some other countries did. And then they also had this protracted Senate investigation, which unfortunately focused way more on political corruption than the actual safety of the vaccine. So the government didn't really try to help citizens understand how safe the vaccine was, following the manufacturer's announcement. So these differences in context are important because they help you understand why people don't trust the vaccine. So we're also going to talk about that a little bit more later. Okay, so let's take a look at some other reasons why people don't trust the vaccine and how they differ. The Kaiser Family Foundation's COVID-19 vaccine monitor found that in the US, Republicans and Black adults are most likely to be vaccine hesitant. But as with the other case studies that we've looked at, you can see that the reasons for that mistrust are quite different. So this is a table that lays out the reasons for vaccine hesitancy by party identification, age, race, and ethnicity. And in the case of Republicans, the main reason why people are hesitant about getting the vaccine, or definitely not, or probably not getting the vaccine, is because they think the risks of COVID-19 are being exaggerated. So they don't think it's as risky as the media and politicians are making out to be. If you look at Black Americans, you can see that they don't share the same opinion. Only 33% of Black Americans think that the risk of COVID-19 are being exaggerated. However, they're concerned about other things. So 71% of them are worried about possible side effects. And similarly, 71% of people think that the vaccine is too new and they want to wait to see how it works for other people. So this could well be that because of historical events that happened in the US that targeted people of color in vaccination programs and testing. So even though Republicans and Black Americans are the two demographic groups that are least likely to get vaccinated in the US, the reasons that they cite are quite different. And next, looking at Hispanic adults, you can see this theme again, of concern about politicization of the vaccine. So Hispanic adults trust their own doctors, but not politicians as much. And that also kind of goes back to the Philippines case study, because in that case, it was partially the political response to the vaccine that drove down trust, right? I'm just going to sum up this section with a quote from Dr. Heidi Larson of the Vaccine Confidence Project. And she says, "I saw how much of the communication strategies were very much driven by what the public health community and immunization people thought the public needed to know. But they were not responding to what people's concerns were, or issues or questions." So if you want to fight vaccine misinformation and get good quality information out there, you need to understand what people's concerns are, and everyone's concern can be quite different. It really depends on the community that you're talking to. So I think we can take a short break here and see if you have any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Esther. I'd like to, you talk about vaccine hesitancy, and this has been a big question in Hong Kong because of some questions over the efficacy of the Sinovac vaccine. When this came out in December, when it was announced that the government was buying a lot of the Sinovac vaccine, Carrie Lam reacted very strongly when there was criticism that it might have been politically motivated, that the vaccine hadn't been properly tested in phase 3 trials. And she said that criticism, or these questions that were raised, she described it as malicious rumors and false information that stigmatizes and politicizes the vaccine purchase on the internet. And in January, Hong Kong University published, was involved in a survey that said that only 1 in 3, I think it was, of Hong Kong people would actually, fewer than 3 in 10 residents were prepared to take the vaccine supplied by Sinovac Biotech. So, what about the messaging in Hong Kong? You cited the example of the classic piece of disinformation that Carrie Lam didn't get the vaccine that she said she was getting. But what do you think of the situation in Hong Kong with this vaccine hesitancy? What do you think of the coverage, and what do you think of the government's messaging to answer this skepticism and also answer this disinformation?
Yeah, I think there are a few layers to why people in Hong Kong are not sure about vaccine, right? So first of all, the vaccine itself, whether it's helpful in general, whether it helped stop the spread of COVID-19. And then the second layer is you've got two options, Sinovac or the BioNTech, right? So people are not sure which one is better. They don't know what they actually going to do to their bodies. And there are obviously scientific studies, peer-reviewed data with all the different trials. But then, so here's the difference. I think with BioNTech, it seems a little bit more transparent. So if you look online, you can dig up a lot of, all the reports are there. If you like, you can read through them. You can go and ask your doctor what they think. But then with Sinovac, I guess there's the extra layer of worry about that is because the transparency is just not great. And also the efficacy range is very different. It can go between like 60 to 90. So that's the second layer, which vaccine I should go for. And then the third layer, what Carrie Lam, how she described people who are critical of the Sinovac vaccine, that's really not helpful because, there's already maybe an issue with trust with Hong Kong government, depending on who you're talking to, right? But then second of all, if people are worried about vaccine, and this should be a problem, about science, about health and well-being. And she, as the leader, probably shouldn't, criticize the people who are criticizing the vaccine because it's not really the point. The point here is, as the leader, as the government, she should really address, the issue with the vaccine. Whether it's safe, if it's not clearly explained, where can people find the information? It should really be a really objective discussion instead of, mixing politics in it. So I feel like the government messaging here is probably not really helping with the vaccine hesitancy in Hong Kong.
Mhm. Okay, thanks. So we'll get other questions, but maybe you can keep going now. We'll pick up where you left off for the next
Okay,
section of your presentation. Thanks.
okay, thank you for that. Okay, so moving on, in this section, we're going to talk about a few themes of vaccine misinformation from first drafts research. So last November, we published a report titled Under the Surface, COVID-19 Vaccine Narratives, Misinformation, and Data Deficits on Social Media. So we did an analysis of 1,200 vaccine-related social media posts that had the highest engagement. And we also analyzed the different themes in vaccine misinformation that we found. So two biggest themes that were dominant across the languages that we did the research in, which were English, French, and Spanish, were political and economic motives, as well as safety, efficacy, and necessity. So this shouldn't really be surprising based on the case studies that we just went through. A lot of the stuff that we just talked about has to do with political and economic motives, right? So it turns out that's what we found in our research as well. And here are the 6 narratives that we found vaccine misinformation fell into. So the first one is political and economic motives. And the second one, safety, efficacy, and necessity. Then development, provision, and access, conspiracy theories, liberty and freedom, as well as morality and religion. And another thing that we found is that vaccine misinformation differs across different languages. So for example, while liberty and freedom is very much a big narrative among English-speaking social media users, we do not see it at all in Spanish-speaking social media. On the other hand, vaccine narratives that have to do with morality and religion were quite common among Spanish speakers, but they're not really that common in the English-speaking online space. Also, the platforms where we found vaccine misinformation also differed according to the language. So, but then one thing that we found was true across the board was that vaccine misinformation is pretty prominent on Instagram, and it's much more prominent on Instagram than it is on Twitter. But then one of the things that makes this interesting is that a lot of research about vaccine misinformation focuses on Twitter, and there isn't as much research about that on Instagram. And this could be just for a number of different reasons. One of the reasons might just be that Instagram is a very visual platform and images can be quite hard to analyze compared to text. And then also, if you're thinking about how to fight vaccine misinformation, it might be in your interest to understand the platforms where it's proliferating. So for example, as we found, Instagram is very much a major platform where this type of misinformation is being shared. And then because it's not also the native search function on Instagram is not easy to use. So either you can search by hashtag or like the location if people geotag the picture or the post. So it's not really that easy to search content on Instagram, and that could be another reason why there's not a lot of research on it. Okay, let's talk about the 6 themes that we found. The first one is political and economic motives. So a couple of examples of this. The first one is that concentrated financial interests drive vaccine development and undermine its safety. That leaders are promoting vaccines for political gains. That corrupt governments and media outlets serve as mouthpieces for big pharma. So the thing that ties us together here is the mistrust of politicians and the mistrust of the influence of money. The second major narrative that we saw across all 3 languages was safety, efficacy, and necessity. So some examples of that. Number 1, the COVID-19 vaccine is a ticket back to normality. So in our research, we didn't just focus on the negative narratives, but also the positive ones. So basically any predominant narratives that we saw across social posts. And this is saying, oh, sorry, 1 second. This is my sensor light making me finish early. Anyway, so back to this. The first example is that people are saying COVID-19 vaccine is a ticket back to normality. So basically that means people believe that vaccine is going to cure everything and solve all the problems, right? It's almost like it's a silver bullet. It's like a magical solution to everything. So even though this narrative essentially it's promoting trust in vaccines, it's also setting up unrealistic expectations. So, when the vaccine turns out not to be the magical solution we wanted it to be, then that can easily be spun into disinformation. Another narrative that we saw is that a healthy immune system is more powerful than a vaccine, which means vaccines are not necessary. If you take care of your body, then you should be fine. So this is worth noting because there's been a lot of misinformation coming out of the alternative therapy wellness world. And sometimes these narratives also can be linked to skepticism about pharmaceutical companies. Another narrative is that mRNA vaccines and GMOs are not safe. So concern about the mRNA technology, concern about the ingredients of vaccines and their safety. Another one that we came across often while we were conducting the research is that, since you poison your body with drugs and alcohol anyway, so of course you can take the vaccine, right? So this is where the vaccine is portrayed as somewhat poisonous, but then the overall sentiment here is pro-vaccine, that you should get it, right? And this is a good example where even positive narratives about vaccines can be potentially weaponized in the future. The third category is development, provision, and access. So 2 examples here are that Russia has won the race to find a COVID-19 vaccine. So this example is prevalent in the online chatter, and not because it's necessarily wrong. And we're not trying to make any judgment here about, the Sputnik 5 vaccine. And in fact, there has been some really positive reports about it lately. So it's more, we're not trying to say whether this is right or wrong, but then what we observed is that one of the main discussions that people talked about when they were talking about vaccine is the race to develop vaccines, right? So it's the race and also sometimes the geopolitics involving in the development of vaccines. Another example in this category is that the provision of vaccines around the world is inequitable, which is probably true. But then again, it's worthwhile to think about how this might be weaponized in the future. So in this case, you might imagine someone saying, well, if you need the whole world to be vaccinated in order to make a difference, then it's never going to happen because provision of vaccines is inequitable. Next up, conspiracy theory. And this was surprisingly popular in French-speaking discourse about vaccines. Two examples. One is that vaccines will microchip and control entire populations. And since Australia began its vaccine rollout just a couple of weeks ago, we've seen this exact narrative about microchip being circulated online once again. So it's just something that you see all the time with basically with COVID-19 disease and also with vaccine. And I think, obviously there's no real basis to it. But then it's something that really scares people because no one want to be controlled, right? So this kind of leads to my second point, another example, which is that vaccines are tools for depopulation programs. So we've seen a lot of these kind of conspiratorial claims, and it's often related to figures like Bill Gates and other elites or rich people saying that they're trying to control the population, and they're doing so with vaccines. And the next category is liberty and freedom. So the interesting thing here is that this category was particularly popular in English-speaking communities, but not as well popular in Spanish-speaking discourse. So you can see again, vaccine information in different countries and across different languages can be quite different. Examples. It starts with a mask, moves on to vaccines, ends in total control. So we've seen this a lot in the US, in the anti-lockdown, anti-quarantine, anti-mask groups. So they're all promoting anti-vaccine sentiment. And the whole idea is that politicians are just finding expensive and more aggressive ways to control us, and they're doing that through vaccines. Another similar example is that mandatory vaccines are harming our rights and freedom. And I guess this is probably one of the main reasons why people across the world have been organizing and attending anti-lockdown rallies in the past year, because they feel like their rights and freedom are being infringed upon, whether it's being told to wear a mask or being asked to take a vaccine, even though COVID-19 vaccines are generally not mandatory, but then people just, this is the general sentiment that they feel they don't feel as free because of the pandemic and what's happening with it. And then next, morality and religion. This one was particularly popular in Spanish-speaking discourse about vaccines. So one example is that the blood of Christ is the only vaccine against COVID-19. And then similarly, God has the power to enlighten scientists to discover coronavirus vaccine. So yeah, so that was probably quite a lot to take in. I guess we can also stop here for a second and look at some of the questions.
How do you compare the kind of you could almost call it traditional anti-vax kind of feeling, there's a big, movement against vaccinations, a growing movement against vaccinations in general, and the sort of resistance on the COVID vaccine. I mean, a lot of people who would never call themselves anti-vaxxers, who don't fall into the conspiracy theories about the measles vaccine and things like that, are skeptical about the COVID-19 vaccine because the speed with which it was pushed through, and it has been politicized. I mean, there is definitely a kind of race, China, Russia. So, I mean, how do you compare the two phenomena? I mean, the end result is a lot of disinformation, but do you see is there an overlap, or how do you see that?
Yeah, I think what you said, Eric, is so true about COVID vaccine, because it was developed so quickly within a year, which is unheard of before then, because, all the other ones would take years, if not decades, right? So I guess with that length of time, you would naturally feel a bit more confident because you assume all the proper procedures is being carried out, it's been tested many times on many different people. But then I guess in this case, but the sentiment is similar, even though the concerns may be quite different, with different vaccines. So it's always that people are not sure whether it would work. And then second of all, do we really need this to control the disease? Maybe there are other ways, like, if I exercise and become stronger, maybe that's a way to do it. So ultimately, they just, I think it's the worry about what's going to happen to them in general. And also, the skepticism, from my point of view, it comes from the competition, within yourself between whether you are more on the rational side, or sometimes you let your emotions kind of take over. Because, theoretically, we all know we should look at scientific study, we should listen to the scientists. But then what if emotionally I feel like the government hasn't been helping me? And then why should I trust them now? So I think it's easy for people who don't feel like that, who are not scared about vaccine or the disease in general, to say, the anti-vaccine communities, they're silly, they're irrational. But then as we, do our research and as we talk to these people, we know that they have their reasons. And usually it's like legitimate worry about the government, about the vaccine, about their health, about their community, about their freedom. So it's really important to, dig deeper and know that particular community that you're talking to. Like, for example, in Hong Kong, what are people's concerns are? What are the main concerns? Let's say you find 5 reasons why people don't want to get vaccinated, but which reasons are more dominant in these 5 things? Maybe it's actually the mistrust towards the government. Then that's probably something that the government has to address. But then if it's a lack of data about the vaccines, then maybe the scientists should, step up and talk more about how the vaccines are developed, what is the data and what would happen to you after you get the jab. So yeah, I think it's just, it's really important to understand what's behind people's concerns.
I've got a question from Christopher Page, and it comes back to Hong Kong. And I don't know to what degree you've studied the sort of disinformation about the vaccine here, but he said, in the case of the disinformation you mentioned on Sinovac inoculation of the Hong Kong chief executive, and obviously we're always looking for what the motivation is behind disinformation and misinformation. He said, is there any evidence in your view that this was orchestrated by government opponents? And did the government's weaker response indicate that the government felt the disinformation campaign was politically motivated? In other words, the disinformation or the skepticism in Hong Kong about the vaccine, was it genuine, or did you see it was also politically motivated? Because obviously the fake, this online upload that was saying that Carrie Lam wasn't actually getting the vaccine that she said she was getting was obviously, I think that would be fairly described as malicious. So, what's your feeling about the sort of motivations of the people spreading this stuff in Hong Kong? Is it genuine, or is there a political motivation?
Yeah, thanks. I think from what I saw, so basically starting from the evening to the next day, there were just so many posts on Facebook, on the forum LIHKG, everywhere talking about she's not getting Sinovac. So you can see there's a general, you can tell they're not confident in the government, basically, because if you trust your leader, you trust what they're talking about, when they talk about vaccine, you wouldn't really necessarily doubt that. And then people also, pull up photos and compare the syringe and say, look, this is not Sinovac, that's probably Pfizer. But then we actually, look deeper into the different packagings and the containers. And I'm pretty sure that was actually Sinovac. But then, so back to your question though, why people were posting about this is, first of all, probably because of discontent towards the government, lack of confidence. They don't believe that the leaders themselves would actually take the Chinese vaccine. And then second of all, whether there was a campaign behind this misinformation. I think a campaign is a word that can be a little bit overused when it comes to misinformation. So it's quite, it's like a buzzword. It's quite trendy and sexy to say, oh, it's a disinformation campaign. But then if we have to confirm that, we would actually have to pull in as many posts as we can. So like in this case with the vaccine research, we did analysis of more than 1,000 posts. So you have to have your data set, and then you have to do a proper data analysis, which is some of my teammates would do. So, and we also have this whole mechanism where we have like 10 signs. And if we find like all these posts hitting maybe 5 or 6 of these signs, then we would say maybe it's a campaign. So, I mean, it shouldn't be the case where a lot of people are posting, the same comments, then we say, oh, maybe there is a campaign. So it should really be like a proper data analysis, then we can talk about it. And also, I mean, this is kind of similar to if you check out Facebook newsrooms press releases, every month they would publish a report about coordinated inauthentic campaign. So that's their wording. And to produce that report, they also have a whole team of people, kind of connecting the dots between different pages, different groups, different accounts, and checking who are behind the accounts. So so it's impossible to say just by looking at the Facebook posts themselves. But what we can say is, the photo after they got vaccinated and after the photos were published, there were just a lot of people talking about the same thing. They don't believe she, had Sinovac. So, I mean, that's also a good indicator where you can see, one of the reasons why people are hesitant about vaccines, right? Maybe it has a lot to do with the government.
How do you think journalists should cover that? I mean, journalists seeing this spreading on social media, how do you deal with it? If you're a Hong Kong journalist and you're seeing a lot of posting, a lot of sharing, at some point I know you don't just debunk any random rumor, but at some point there's a tipping point where it becomes a story in itself. But so how should journalists approach this if they see this, which is,
I think
probably fake? I mean, how do you cover it without? I mean, the big danger also is what they call amplification, as you know, which is giving it a broader coverage. So what's the best approach for journalists seeing this kind of thing online?
So I'll answer this question from the point of view of a fact checker or a journalist, right? So as a fact checker, for example, back at AFP Fact Check, we were always talking about whether we should report on something depends on whether it's impactful. So whether it's making an impact online, and usually maybe in real life as well. So in this case, if we report on this, it's probably because it's just making people feeling really skeptical about vaccine online. And then we see maybe a drop in people registering for the vaccine, right? So this is the impact, and we will only debunk something if we think it's going to have a negative impact on society. And then second of all, whether it's viral enough. So kind of similar, if something, if there are like, dozens of people talking about it online, it could just be, an opinion or like a short-term concern about vaccine. But then if you see it across many different platforms, and in the case of Hong Kong, maybe in English and Chinese and some other languages as well, and all the posts, keep coming online, and not just within a couple of hours, maybe into the next day and throughout the week as well, then we would think, look, it's going viral and it's probably going to have an impact in some way, so we should debunk it, right? So that's a fact checker's job. And then from the point of a journalist, I think when you notice something that's, again, maybe kind of shaping how people think about important issue like public health, then you probably should address it, but in a really careful way. I mean, first of all, with the headline, you shouldn't just write something like, Carrie Lam may not have had the Chinese vaccine. So headline needs a lot of work. And if you just throw something like that and publish it, that's just going to make a lot of people feel their worry is confirmed. So, and apart from the headline, I think in the report, it's worth talking about a big group of people are concerned about this. But then overall, your report should be framed in a way that, we started vaccine rollout and this little thing happened, but then overall, the vaccine is, 90% effective, or just back it up with a lot of important scientific data that people really should know. So kind of leading them from focusing on a rumor to back to the facts, why we should do this, why we should get vaccinated, because it's good for you and it's safe. So I guess just really depends on how you write your headline and also frame your reporting.
I mean, I noticed that this week, the South China Morning Post's coverage, for example, of the man who unfortunately died after he got the Sinovac, and they were quite careful. They very quickly pointed out that he had serious pre-existing conditions, and that there was immediately going to be an inquiry, and they were continuing the program. And then today they come out and basically said that he was in bad physical shape, so they tried to separate the two. It was, the presentation was not sensational, which it could have been. So I think journalists definitely have a responsibility there. So can we continue with your presentation?
Yeah. Okay. And so we're going into the last section, where I'm going to walk you through some of the main tactics that we've seen for spreading vaccine misinformation. So one of the main tactics is called headline laundering, which is basically what happens when somebody recycles a negative or ambiguous bit of news, especially where the headline doesn't tell the whole story. So kind of just like what we talked about in the question just now. In this example, in the Facebook group Open Oregon, there is this post that says, "No need to quarantine if you had both doses of the vaccine. See where this is headed?" ? And it links to an article saying that in the state of Oregon, they are revising their quarantine guidelines for vaccinated people. So this kind of sparked a number of theories in the comment section. And one of them was that, this is just a way to get everybody to take the vaccine, because if you don't want to be quarantined, then you should get the vaccine, right? Next up, conspiracy theories. So conspiracy theories vary, but then one thing that they have in common is that they feed off of deep mistrust of politicians, political actors, and institutions. And seeing what happened in Pakistan, you probably can see how some people might have good reason to. Another big theme that we see repeatedly is that vaccine misinformation is overwhelmingly driven by videos and photos. Compelling misinformation, often comes in the form of visuals, because visual content is difficult to fact check. And counter messaging, like, if we publish a long form articles or debunks, they're just not as flashy and they may not compete as well. Because, for example, if I give you like a fun, really, really well produced video to watch compared to asking you to read an article of like 10,000 words, the video is obviously a lot more attractive. Also, a lot of misinformation about vaccine comes from old misinformation tropes, and we call it zombie content. So, for example, like the false accusation that the MMR vaccine, which is used against measles, can lead to autism. And these are the narratives that we've seen being recycled over and over again, but just in different forms. And to sum up today's session, we've learned that even if two groups of people or two different countries are distrustful of vaccines, that mistrust could be caused by very different reasons. And we've looked at the 6 narratives of vaccine misinformation from First Draft's research. And just to recap, they are political and economic motives, safety, efficacy, and necessity, development, provision, and access, conspiracy theories, liberty and freedom, and morality and religion. And then also, we discussed some common tactics used to weaponize uncertainty, such as headline laundering, conspiracy theories, the use of visuals, as well as zombie content. So congrats, you made it to the end. But then once again, I just want to let you know that if you want to keep track of the most prominent misinformation about vaccine and learn about how to find them online, how to monitor it, how to address it, please sign up to our newsletter and also our flexible learning courses, and they're all free. We're just hoping to publish these resources in this time to help people understand more about vaccine, how to tackle misinformation. And if you want to read that report I talked about, the research about vaccine misinformation, you can just head to the training section of our website. So it's called Under the Surface, and the whole report will be there. Okay, so thank you so much for having me. I'm just gonna leave. Oh, stop sharing my screen.
Hey, thanks, Esther. A lot of information there. Maybe you could give us some links. We could when we post this on the site, you could give us some useful links that we could post.
Yeah, sure.
I've got a question from Andrew Eden. He says, to what extent would this, what he calls social dilemma, brackets, the way the social media delivers content to us all in a slightly different way, okay, be to blame for the spread of misinformation?
So what was the question again?
Okay, to what extent would the social dilemma, in quotes, i.e. the way social media delivers content to us all in a slightly different way, be to blame for the spread of misinformation?
Yeah, thanks. Look, I guess this is also tying to the big question, how platforms are performing and whether it's good for us or not, right? So, I mean, there's a really interesting case study actually with Australia in the past couple of weeks. You know how Facebook banned news assets here 2 weeks ago, but then 4 or 5 days later, they backed down after talking to the government, saying, look, we still want to provide news content for Australian users. So now we're back at the negotiating table. So this is an interesting case study because a lot of people raised the point that, when it comes to misinformation or extremist groups on Facebook, they didn't seem to be as decisive with their action. But then with limiting news access in Australia, when it comes to something to do with, the legislation and things they have to comply, they seem to just do it like that without any warning. So, I mean, look, the internal policy, what happened within the company, no one knows. But then I feel like things with public health, like COVID-19, vaccines in general, platforms should really adopt a different approach. For the longest time, they say they don't want to moderate news, they don't want to do anything about any information on their platform. Everyone should just say whatever they want, right? I mean, that's kind of like the ideal world. But then when you have a product that's profit driven and it's reaching almost everyone in the world, you do have some sort of responsibility, especially when it comes to public health. So, I mean, they do, like Facebook and Twitter now, for a while now, they do link to, like the information center about vaccine, and they also lead you to like the WHO or CDC websites when you try to search for vaccine. So these are like some of the measures that I think they do seem to work, because even from a journalist point of view, sometimes when I want to look up what's the latest vaccine misinformation, I can't actually search on Facebook or Twitter because I wouldn't get the results. Then I have to, find some workaround. So I guess in a way, it kind of helps, but then whether, what's the actual impact and how much it has helped, I think at the moment it's still too early to say.
A question from Rory Thompson, a kind of broader question on the motivations, excuse me, motives for people spreading disinformation. I mean, when it comes to the COVID vaccine or other, I mean, is the motivation to specifically to spread specific disinformation about vaccines, or is it just they think this will go viral? They want to create viral content online and going down the path of creating disinformation about vaccines is a good way to go. I mean, how much of it is actually deliberate and how much of it is just an effort to get a big make a big social media impact?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very clever observation, because definitely there are people trying to profit off this, right? I mean, the easiest way to do it is you can upload a video of yourself talking for 5 minutes about nothing and then title it, oh, big news, vaccine is here, and then people are going to find it when they do the search. And, that's probably the most searched topic at the moment. So definitely a lot of people are trying to, either get famous or make some money off it. But then from what I can see on a day-to-day basis, I think most of the misinformation about vaccine comes from either concern about their own health, again, whether I'm gonna, have some sort of adverse reaction if I get the vaccine, what's gonna happen to my child or my old parents, so that sort of thing. It's very personal, very relatable in a way. Like, you try to understand why they're worried as well as a journalist. I get why they're scared. And then second of all, another thing that I see almost every day is basically the mistrust towards the government. So it will always go like, oh, there is the vaccine and we think it's going to be mandatory. You know why? Because the government want to control us. Or vaccine has not arrived in Australia. And you know why? Because the government doesn't want to help us. So, these are the two themes that I see every day. And I do believe a majority of these people talking about it and, sharing inaccurate or sort of baseless information is probably because they're worried and they're sort of just, sharing. They feel like using social media is like sharing with your friends, like what I'm worried about, let's talk it out. But then unfortunately, when you're in a public space like social media, you can potentially affect a lot of people because people can share your post and, and if you post your thoughts and your concern, let's say in a Facebook group with 100,000 members, then you're basically sharing, something that you haven't even have time to prove or understand with 100,000 people. And let's say 20% of them believe in you. And then so this is also back to the question of, platforms should probably take a stance on this sort of issue because they do have that amplifying power sort of intrinsically.
I mean, the Hong Kong University survey, Professor Gabriel Long, who was involved in this, he said that global confidence in the vaccine was broadly declining as misinformation and confusion over the shots increased. I mean, you're very involved in the whole world of fact-checking, news literacy. Are you fighting a losing battle?
I don't think so because, you know how we talked about briefly, my light, sorry.
Your light.
Yeah, so you know how we try to fact check on one hand, and on the other hand, you have organizations like First Draft trying to provide a lot of training, trying to explain to people why there is misinformation. So I feel like with time, you can see that this is a winning battle because more and more people are aware that if they're concerned about something on social media or online, they should try to look up a fact check article, because they know there are some people trying to provide facts, right? So for example, you click into the AFP fact check website, it's basically like a portal with all the, proven facts that you can rely on. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is if you, attend more trainings by organizations like First Draft, or, just read up a lot more on the internet about how to react when you come across information that you're not sure about. So you can, so then you feel a lot more prepared when you next time, whether you should share it or whether you should talk about it so publicly on social media. So I feel like with both of these approaches, we will probably get better in the future. Like we wouldn't have such a what was it called, information endemic or something like that. The actual term. Hopefully.
Just to finish up, we're almost out of time, Esther. Again, just to sort of recap, what advice would you give to journalists here who, we cover lots of things in Hong Kong, but this is a bit of a discovery for everybody, the whole world of vaccines, and it's a complex issue. What advice would you give to journalists confronted with this and the kind of disinformation that inevitably is going to come up in the future? And also you can sort of slightly promote First Draft there. You said you have resources online. What advice would you give journalists here covering these issues, and what kind of resources would you point them to?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that I think journalists should really think about is just don't jump the gun. It's easy to react like, oh my God, people are talking about this, so we should be one of the first to report, right? And sure, you should try your best to do that. But then on the other hand, you should also understand that this is an issue that is a matter of people's health and life as well. So it's not so much about whether you're the first reporter reporting on this. So I feel like it's important to think about a headline, talk to your editors about how we should frame this story, how this is going to reflect on us as a newsroom, and also the long-term impact. Like if you started out reporting on just everyone, like the old man who died after taking the Sinovac vaccine, and if you just write a headline saying this person died after the vaccine, even if later on your reports become a lot more like mature, a lot more fact-based, people will always remember that you said that before, as this news organization. So I'm not sure whether to trust you again. So I guess just take the time, really think about the impact before reporting on issue about COVID and vaccine. And in terms of First Draft resources, and I'm not just saying this because I work for First Draft, I think it's just an awesome website where you can find a lot of training resources, like how to monitor online, how to find the information, just kind of understand what people are talking about and how the news events and how they react to the issue altogether shape the attitude in society. And I find it very interesting myself. And also, there are a lot of articles that we've written on the website about this, the psychology of misinformation, why people buy into it. Why is it so hard that after people believe in something, why is it so hard to change their mind? So I feel like those articles are really interesting if you're interested in this topic in general.
And that you can sign up to First Draft and get the information, right?
Yeah. So apart from the vaccine newsletter that I just talked about, we also have a daily and weekly newsletter. So that would be about misinformation, conspiracy theories in general. Like, last year, we obviously reported a lot on the US election. So all the election fraud argument. So those are pretty cool as well. And it's all free. Feel free to sign up on the website.
I think you've got a series of talks on the vaccines at the moment. No, I watched one presentation you gave a week or two ago.
Yeah. So that's part of the flexible learning courses, we call it. Basically, every week we will have a webinar. It will be 30 minutes, and then we will just talk about something about the vaccine misinformation, either giving you some skills, how to search for it online, how to monitor it, or different types of vaccine misinformation. So I'm currently hosting one every Tuesday at 12 p.m. Hong Kong time.
Okay,
and
great.
I think we have like 7 or 8 more to go. So yeah, I hope to see you in those sessions every Tuesday.
Fantastic, and we'll put the link on the FCC site. So thank you very much. That was very valuable. Thank you. Great, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.